You know what I mean? And that inherently comes with a lot of issues still, and it clearly doesn't work, but it certainly works better than America. And it's very interesting to see it because, like, as is the case with every developing nation and every developed nation, it's not hyper individualism that makes it wonderful. It is literally held together by centuries of collectivist sentiment. Here, have like just full tilt capitalism, okay? Capitalism with a gigantic emphasis on like nationalism. So you know what I mean? Like, it's not supposed to work, but it does.
Oh no.
Do not work.
You give me the other one.
Yeah, it
wait,
works.
there we go.
Yummy.
So I looked everywhere for Monster Cubed. Don't know what it is. Oof, just smells like original Monster. It just tastes like original, but really strong. So, hello everyone, once again from the capitalist dystopia of the United Kingdom. Now, it's my second day of filming with COVID. I'm actually feeling worse today, but I'm hoping I'm going to plateau at like this level. I hope I don't wake up tomorrow feeling even worse, because I've got to make another video. But today I want to talk about my travels around Asia and focus in particular on Japan. And I know recently also Hasan went to Japan and he documented it quite well, and he also spoke about the economics of Japan, and he spoke about capitalism in Japan. Now, I know a lot of my subscribers also like Hasan, and I also know from experience making videos on Hasan, a lot of people don't actually watch the video, they just see the title and start unsubscribing. And if you've followed my channel for long enough, you know that I have criticized Hasan. I criticized him for all that stuff with like reaction videos on Twitch, but I've also defended Hasan like with that whole stupid house drama and stuff. And overall, as political Twitch streamers go, I think he is a lot better than most because he's not toxic and he's not completely focused on drama. And today's video is going to be talking about what he said about capitalism in Japan. I'm going to use obviously like my own views of going to Japan and what I think about it. Then I'm going to read some pushback from his own audience of people who grew up like homeless in Japan, who said he didn't really paint an accurate picture, and then just give some facts, and we can have a general discussion about, does capitalism actually work in Japan, or what does that even mean? What does capitalism working mean? Does capitalism working mean a functioning society, or does capitalism working mean extracting wealth from the workers of society to enrich the 1%? And I saw Hasan recently talking, when responding to some like TYT drama, saying that he gets so much bad faith attacks. I hope that people can recognize, if you're fans of him, this isn't in bad faith. I'm just gonna criticize the stuff he said and talk about why he might have missed some of the problems inherent in Japanese capitalism, because he probably doesn't actually know much about Japanese capitalism other than actually just going to Japan and seeing Japanese society firsthand. Whereas myself, I wouldn't say I'm like a massive expert in Japanese politics, but you know, if you guys have followed me for a while, you've seen that I've made quite a few videos on Japanese politics. Japanese history and international relations is stuff I have studied during my time at university, part of my master's course and stuff. So I feel like I know it better than a lot of people in the West. I, of course, don't know it better than most Japanese people, though. So all of that coming up for you today. Please like the video, and in the comments, have you been to Japan? Let me know what you thought of Japan. Also, follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter, but also on Instagram. And Instagram is where I posted all about my travels around Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia as well. And that was all documented on my stories, but I've actually put all my stories on my profile page. And in terms of Japan and Korea, I actually documented it by day. So if you're really curious about what I did during my time in Japan specifically, that is all on my Instagram page, and you can go watch that in detail on the highlight reels itself. Also consider becoming a patron. I'm trying to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible. There is also some exclusive travel content on my Patreon page, and there is a video about my time in Thailand I recorded with my girlfriend. We actually are going to be committed to recording about every country we went to, so I will get round to talking about Japan with her too at some point. And again, that's just for patrons. Other benefits include getting access to the Discord server and getting access to my Nintendo Switch friend code. And also check out my subreddit and check out my second channel down in the description. So if you're just here for the breakdown of what Hasan said and my reaction to it, and also talking about the politics of Japan, maybe look at the timestamps and skip forward, because like I said, just like Hasan, I recently went to Japan and I want to talk about it quick as well. So I lived in Southeast Asia for about 7 months, only got home last week, got COVID already, isn't that amazing? And I stayed in Vietnam, Thailand and Cambodia, and to finish the trip, me and my girlfriend did about, I don't even know, 9, 10, 11 days in Japan and Korea. And Japan was the main trip we did. So we went to Tokyo for 4 days, went to Kyoto for 3 and a bit days before flying to Seoul. And of course, I was born and raised in London, which is another developed city in a developed country. But I have to say, Tokyo is probably my most favorite place I've ever been to. Tokyo specifically, I prefer Tokyo to Kyoto and Osaka, although I did like Osaka more than Kyoto. But yeah, Tokyo is just absolutely amazing. It just feels very, very clean. Everyone says that and they go there. And of course, I've grown up in a nice part of London and it is also very clean, but I think Tokyo is just next level clean. It's also amazingly quiet, which seems like a weird thing to praise. But because London, and even when I went to Seoul, the traffic is pretty crazy. And of course, I lived in Vietnam and Thailand where the traffic is absolutely insane. Going to where the Parliament building is at rush hour on a weekday, and basically there being no cars around, just blew my mind. But it creates such a nice atmosphere walking around. And what I love so much about Japan, and I guess a lot of modern cities, is that we didn't really plan to do anything in Tokyo. We would just have a destination like Harajuku to check out the shopping and stuff. And then from there, we just walk. We just look somewhere on a map and we're like, oh, that looks like a park. Let's walk towards it. And then you just get sidetracked and we'd find these amazing shrines just randomly, not looking for them. And then you'd go down alleyways and find new places. And Hasan said this as well. I took thousands of photos. Tokyo is absolutely beautiful. And it just looks so different from any other city that I've been to in my life. Because I guess with Asian cities in particular, a lot of them look very, very modern. And a lot of them have these skyscrapers with all these crazy lights. I guess part of it is because these countries suffered from these devastating wars, which destroyed so many of these cities, like Cambodia, Vietnam, and of course Japan in World War II with Tokyo. And then in the ashes of these wooden buildings all being burnt down by fire bombings and stuff, they've really developed these cities. And unlike Europe and unlike London, Seville, Granada, where everywhere looks so ancient because it's literally a city that has been built consistently for 2,000 years, Tokyo just mostly feels very, very new. I guess that's why so many people simp for Asian countries thinking they're the future, because just the architecture you see there, the billboards, the neon, it really isn't like anything you see, especially in Europe and Western countries. So yeah, so many photos. Osaka especially gave me that Blade Runner vibe as well, but Tokyo did as well, but not as much as I thought really, because I really thought, because things like cyberpunk are so inspired by Japan especially, you think when you go there it might actually resemble it. But I found places like Phnom Penh in Cambodia to actually resemble cyberpunk more. But that's just talking about walking around. The public transport is really good, but also I will say what I think about when Americans go there, the public transport in America is so garbage. Well, I've grown up in London, which historically does have very good public transport. So when I get the Tokyo subway, it feels very much like the London Underground. Although it is a lot nicer, I will admit that. It's also a lot cleaner. But in essence, it feels very, very similar. Even the little Oyster card thing I bought. So I wasn't amazed by the public transport taking me all around the city. Maybe you would if you grew up only in American stuff. But the trains are very, very good there. Tokyo especially, it's really easy to use the trains. I did find it a bit harder in Kyoto, to be honest, because there's not as much English around. And it can get quite confusing as well, on the way to the airport to fly to Seoul, we did like book the wrong train, even though it looked like we booked the right one, where that didn't really happen in Tokyo. But yeah, Tokyo is massive. There's so much to explore. I can't wait to go back. And I think for tourism, it's just like an absolutely amazing city. But even things like the vending machines, and I love the vending machines, and I use it to get like Monster, coffee, and it was amazing that these places were just everywhere. I guess when you think about it a bit more, it's a bit more sinister. And I actually might make a whole video on the vending machines in Tokyo and Japan. Let me know if you want this, because I recently found out that coffee breaks in America were done so people would work harder, and only thanks to like the Supreme Court did coffee breaks have to be paid. And then I'm thinking, when I look at the vending machines, most vending machines are just filled with energy drinks and coffee. So I'm thinking, why do you want everyone to have such easy access to caffeine all the time? Could it be you want them, I don't know, to stay and work longer? As just a place to just go as a tourist, and especially because I've been living in like Vietnam before this, but you know, poorer parts of Southeast Asia, and I've been really craving like the clean air. I've been really craving like the park. I've been really craving like something that resembled England more. Tokyo to me really reminded me of London, and I mean that in a good way. Like, I don't think England is a great country. London has its issues, but the parts that I like about London, I think Tokyo is just like way, way better. Like I said, better public transport, cleaner. Also, there isn't like this tension in the air as much. Even when we went to like the red light district quite late at night, I didn't feel it as much when I go out late at London. Like, no matter where I go, there's that tension in the air. Southeast Asia and East Asia just have a culture of like staying out later, which is nicer. And of course, you know, the safety is something people talk a lot about in Japan. And although I want to talk about that a tiny bit later, yes, in terms of like actual violent crimes, it's far, far lower than somewhere like London. And the one criticism I will say, Asia in general is just terrible for vegetarians if you just want to be more casual about it. I'm not vegetarian, but my girlfriend is. So we did find like some cool, authentic ramen places, which did do like a vegan option or a veggie option. But it was really hard to just go into a random place and hope they would, you know, serve you something vegetarian. I guess that's why sushi is good, because there are vegetarian options. I did have authentic sushi and ramen. I really liked it. And I think I'll end it on this. The convenience store food quality in Tokyo is like absolutely ridiculous, because I get like meal deals and stuff in Tesco in the UK. And of course, they're like 7-Elevens and those types of stores around Southeast Asia. But the best thing you're getting from them is maybe like, I don't know, a pastry and maybe a coffee, maybe a toasted sandwich. But in Tokyo, like the sandwiches were amazing. Family Mart, 7-Eleven. The coffee options were pretty good. The sushi was really good. And I'm just like, this is so great. And it was pretty cheap as well. And our hotel had like this nice like common area where everyone would just come back at night and they'd all eat like convenience store meals. But you can actually do that because the quality is pretty good. And it is, like I said, very convenient to get whatever you want. But is there a dark side to that? Is there a reason why so much food and caffeine is available everywhere? And a final criticism is, let me know if this is the truth if you're like Japanese. I found the coffee in Japan to be pretty terrible. It was just so bitter. Like every single coffee I drank there was just like crazy bitter without putting loads of sugar in. I guess that's because I've been drinking Vietnamese coffee, which is like really chocolatey and sweet. And that, you know, I really prefer that. But yeah, that's one thing about Japan. Absolutely love Japan. Go check out my Instagram to see like everywhere I went. Absolutely love Tokyo. Really want to go back. I actually want to live there for like a month or more, because the visa exemption you can get there is actually pretty long compared to a lot of other places. And I just really liked it. And it is just very seductive to a Western tourist, because you get there and you think about all the nice things you see, and you think about, why can't we have this in our own country? But I didn't just think about that in Japan. I thought that in Thailand, sometimes thought about it in Vietnam and Cambodia as well. And I think maybe that's why me traveling around Southeast Asia is probably helpful in this discussion we're going to have about Japanese capitalism supposedly like working or not, because I think a lot of the things Hasan praises about Japan are actually cultural things you find in a lot of Buddhist countries. And he was talking about things like homelessness. I saw more homeless people in Japan than I did in Thailand and Vietnam. I think Buddhism and more like collectivism is more responsible for things working than capitalism, which Hasan does admit himself. And something I was very conscious about while walking through Japan, like I even said about the vending machines, is I'm just a tourist here. They're treating me very, very nicely. They're very welcoming. They're very friendly. but I don't experience any of the problems here. So I see a lot of posts often on like the UK subreddits of Americans going to London talking about how amazing London is, how amazing the UK is. And yeah, it probably is amazing when you're a tourist, but you don't have to really experience living here. The same way me and Hasan, we go to Japan, we go to Tokyo, and we think, absolutely amazing. This is like the best place on earth. But we don't have to experience like the work culture, xenophobia. We don't have to deal with like literally a party funded by the CIA historically ruling Japan for basically the whole post-war period. We don't have to deal with all these issues because we are just tourists. We get to enjoy the best parts of Japan. We get to either ignore or we don't even see the bad parts because we're either there for such a little time, or because we don't speak the language, we can't fully absorb the culture. And I think that's something that's helpful no matter where you travel, is that no matter how good you think a place is, especially if they don't speak the same language as you, you will never ever really be able to experience what it's really like there. So going around telling people that like maybe Japanese capitalism works when you pretty much know nothing about it besides the aesthetics, I don't think is very helpful. But on that note, I want to talk about this. Again, good faith criticism and just a good faith response. Don't get too mad at me. I know some Hasan fans don't really like me saying anything bad about him. I'm just going to play some of this video and then I'm going to give my initial reaction to it based on also going to Japan recently, and then we're going to get into like very, very specific issues. I got a bunch of like segments of articles to read about work culture, about capitalism, about the treatment of like migrant workers in Japan. So we're going to get into all of that.
As is the case with every developing nation and every developed nation, it's not in hyper individualism that makes it wonderful. It is literally held together by centuries of collectivist sentiment that is like deeply ingrained. That's it. The only thing that keeps Japan going, despite its hyper-capitalist dystopian attitude and modes of existence and modes of production, is the literal thousands of years of collectivism deeply ingrained and institutionalized and reinforced culturally through a culture of shame, but also through a culture of education. And you see it. It's built into the core that it unironically even makes this hyper dystopian capitalist nonsensical mode of existence operate in the way that it does. Don't worry, there's some really interesting things I talked to Gigik about too, by the way, about Japan, because like it's not supposed to work. These here have like just full tilt capitalism, okay? Capitalism with a gigantic emphasis on like nationalism. So you know what I mean? Like it's not supposed to work, but it does. Well, obviously it doesn't in the grand scheme of things because the population is aging. Younger population is very frustrated with a lack of opportunity. They have social safety nets, even though those social safety nets are like still relatively cheaper in comparison to other countries. So it's not supposed to work. Like Japan is not supposed to work at all, right? Because it's crazy. Capitalism in Japan is just like, is on overdrive, but it works. What holds it together? This is something that I'm genuinely shocked about because it works in the sense that there are still many, many issues, but in comparison to America, which is also a hyper-capitalist dystopia, Japan legitimately runs like a well-oiled machine. And I think that there is the collectivist bent certainly plays a role in it. I've talked about this a lot, but I also found another thing that Gigik was talking about that I find very interesting. I was like, how the does this work? Why aren't there like more homeless people? You know what I mean? He's like, you get into a company and you get hired to work in a company, you're never getting fired. They will bully you relentlessly to stop you from actually working at the company, but you are there for life. No matter how you are, they never fire you. No, they literally won't fire you. You have to quit. Yeah, they'll do everything to try and get you to quit, but they won't fire you. You know what I mean? And that inherently comes with a lot of issues still, and it clearly doesn't work, but it certainly works better than America, and it's very interesting to see it.
So Hasan is obviously a streamer, and he's obviously responding to the chat there as well. So his thoughts on this don't seem as like well put together as maybe they should be. It seems to be more like a gut reaction about seeing Japan and then wanting to share it with your followers. And I basically think the important thing to note there is he's saying, well, in comparison to America. And I think that is important because yes, in comparison to America, as I said with Americans often posting about Britain, a lot of countries look amazing because America's so garbage. Like America is basically the blueprint of how not to run a country for the people and how to run a country for the capitalist class. So in that comparison, a country like Japan, which has a pretty traditional social safety net, has like good public transport, has universal healthcare, well, it's gonna look amazing, isn't it? Because if you grow up in a place like LA, which compared to like other modern cities and stuff is nothing special, you're gonna think Japan is like the best country ever. I bet loads of Americans think like London and Paris and loads of cities across Europe are also absolutely amazing because of how much they contrast against America. But also something to keep in mind, when I talk about capitalism, I think about various countries being like monuments to different forms of capitalism, and America is one. That is like the absolute like deregulation of everything to enrich the 1%. And then in the UK you have something more classist, where the people who rule over us have literally ruled this country for the last like 1,000 years, and they're all mates. They all go to the same schools together, and then they all become part of the ruling elite together. So it's very different from America in that way. And then you have something like Russia, which is a more like centralized authoritarian capitalist state where all the capitalist class are directly in bed with the dictatorship there. You have a country like Korea as well, which takes like some of the worst elements of Japan and some of the worst elements of a country like Russia and America and mashes them all together. And then of course you have Japan as another form. Now Hasan keeps calling it like dystopian capitalism. I wouldn't call Japan any more dystopian than like a lot of other countries. I just think it has its own like more unique problems. But I do think it's just another country that resembles kind of like what capitalism becomes. But like I said, Hasan, like me, is an outsider. To an outsider, Tokyo looks amazing. You go to Tokyo, you think, this is the future. Why can't I live like this? Why can't the UK be like Tokyo? But like I said, like Hasan is saying there, he doesn't know the reality. He hasn't experienced it. And in good faith, I don't think he actually knows too much about Japan anyway. Like, he might have spoke to some people there. I don't think he knows too much about the history. I don't think he knows too much about the form of economics there. And I don't think he knows too much, because if he's saying capitalism is working there, then I guess he's talking about the society functioning. But a lot of the things that are good about Japan don't need a massive profit incentive to do, because like I was saying, because I've traveled Southeast Asia, a lot of things that seem good about Japan, like the safety, like feeling safe at night, not seeing violent crime, people wearing masks in very, very close spaces. You see that a lot in Thailand with malls. Vietnam isn't as good, but Vietnam does that as well. But I think Vietnam does it more for pollution reasons. And you see things to do with like cleanliness. In my experience, places like Chiang Mai and Bangkok, also very, very clean. And the thing that unites a lot of these countries is Buddhism, Chinese influence as well, with Confucius. Of course, in Japan, you have Shintoism as well. And I think a lot of these things promote something about the collective more, which Hasan recognizes. But I don't think that says anything about capitalism working. And then one more thing I just want to quickly react to before we get into it. Him saying it's very hard to get fired in Japan and you basically have a job for life at a company. I don't think that's a positive thing. That sounds to me you're choosing which company to be a slave to. And he's saying they will bully you to quit, but then a lot of people don't quit their jobs in Japan and they do become slaves to like one corporation. And then of course Japan is absolutely infamous for its insanely toxic work culture. Korea is another one. Like, Korea has the same problem. Recently the government backed down on putting like, is it like an 85-hour work week into place? And in a lot of Asian countries you have that thing. In Japan as well, you can't leave work until your boss leaves in certain countries, so you can't really admit that. And also I would say, he talks about like capitalism working because of like the cleanliness or maybe the trains being so good. But if you think about the UK, a lot of the good things in the UK have been pushing back against capitalism. So the NHS, for example, was created by a socialist government after the Second World War and has been totally eroded by the capitalist class. All our train services used to be nationalised. Our energy service used to be nationalised. It used to be better. And then with people like Margaret Thatcher, we sold them all off to corporations and they have gotten worse. Like, UK used to run better when capitalism couldn't infringe as much in society. Like, Japan's trains running well and stuff, they're still run by private companies. And yeah, getting the bullet train is pretty cool and everything. It's not like it's especially cheap. I paid like 90 quid for my ticket from Tokyo to Kyoto. And then you have all the problems of just a typical capitalist country as well. Rent, wages. We're going to get into all of this today, especially migrant workers, which one of Hasan's own fans called him out about with this little clip I showed you. But I just want to read some articles. So the first one is unions in Japan. So I made a whole video about this, but Japan actually has a pretty popular communist party. I saw some communist party posters because it's election season in Japan, or it was when I was there. Japan, of course, has been run by one party for most of its history, but you do have popular left-wing elements historically as well, but that hasn't actually translated to a lot of union membership. And Japan actually has union membership comparable to the United States as well. I've read different things, but the US and some similar countries, it's like 11 to like 14%. And then if we look at Japan, and this is an article that came out a couple months ago, number of union members in Japan dips below 10 million for the first time in 5 years. As of June 30th, 2022, there were 9,900,000 labor union members in Japan. The percentage of employees belonging to labor unions in Japan fell by 0.4 percentage points year on year to an estimated 16.5%. The ratio of such organized workers had risen at the beginning of the pandemic, but declined in the years following. The current percentage is the lowest since 1947, when statistics were first compiled. So that is just one element, just like America. If you don't have organized labor, you don't really have an organized check on the government. And while you might have some collectivism in terms of the responsibility to maybe not littering or not doing violent crime to people or stuff like that, you still do not have a significant union movement in Japan, meaning that more of the population are at the mercy of the capitalist class. And what really happens, like so much of Japan, just like a lot of Western countries as well, is privatized. So if they start really upping all the fares on trains and stuff like that, then what are people meant to do about it? But yes, cynically, what I think is why a lot of things run so well in Japan is to just get people easier into work. The same reason capitalists like Elon Musk want UBI, because it's like a general subsidy for consumer capitalism. They don't want people to be more free to pursue interests outside of work. Even if there are good things in society, you can still recognize that a lot of it is designed in the service of capital. But I also read a good article from 2021 on Reuters, and I think is good at outlining specific issues of Japan, because like I said, me and Hasan go there, have a great time, think it's the best place ever. I still think it's a great tourist destination, but you read an article like this to really get an insight into more of the problems. So Japan confronts rising inequality after Abenomics. So Japan's stock market has surged and luxury cars are selling fast in Tokyo after 8 years of economic stimulus under Abenomics, but that new wealth is concentrated in a small slice of society rather than broadly distributed. Who would have thought something named after like Reaganomics would be trickle-down economics? So addressing the divide that has become a high priority for new Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who promised to tackle income disparity made worse by the pandemic, but he has also offered few clues to how he will do so. It's like everyone has become poor, said Masanori Aoki, 62, who owns a small coffee shop in a working-class district of Tokyo. With Abenomics, the finance minister talked about wealth trickling down. Where have we heard that before? But there was no such thing, was there? Almost nothing, said Aoki, who took a job as a part-time kindergarten bus driver when the pandemic forced him to shut down his shop. Kimi Kubayashi, 55, who works at a childcare facility in Tokyo, says her wages haven't risen in 4 years. She said many who work in the industry are resigned to the fact that salaries rarely increase. I can't say that my livelihood is getting any better. The government collects tax, but that money isn't used to help people who are really in need. Abenomics, a dose of huge monetary fiscal support and growth strategy that boosted stocks and corporate profits, failed to create wealth to households via higher wages, data showed. Japan's poverty rate is the second highest among G7 nations and the 9th highest among OECD countries, according to the organization's survey based on data available to 2020. Nominal wages rose just 1.2% from 2012 through 2020, government data showed, and Japanese households' average wealth fell by 3.5% from 2014 to 19, although the top 10 wealthiest saw an increase, according to another government survey. To be sure, inequality is far more pronounced in countries like the US and Britain, but the situation did improve for some in Japan. Manabu Fujisaki recently splurged on a 7 million yen Mercedes-Benz after reaping a huge sum from investing in cryptocurrencies. Abenomics brought us investors huge profits. The central bank money pumping pushed up prices of financial securities. So what I just read you sounded just like what they do in the UK. It sounded just like what they do in the US as well. People's wages stagnating, creating economic policies to enrich the 10% in this instance, or the 1% in other countries, at the expense of everyone else. You know, Abenomics, just like Reaganomics, was trickle down economics, right? Loads of Western countries have done as well. So yeah, we can go to Japan, we can see how it's like nicer aesthetically than a lot of places. It's cleaner, public transport's better, lovely vending machines, lovely family mart everywhere and stuff like that. Just because there isn't like insane violence and homelessness like some parts of LA doesn't mean Japanese capitalism like works in any significant way for the people. It works for the same people it works for in our Western countries me and Hasan grew up in. It doesn't work for the people overall. And in Japan itself, just like America, they're more at the mercy of corporations because the union movement is so small. And like I said, the aesthetics of Japan, walking around Japan is so seductive. But if you don't live there, you don't have to deal with this. You don't have to deal with wages, especially if you're a very, very rich Twitch streamer. You don't even have to think about that ever. So now I want to talk about Japan's like work culture on top of this trickle down economics. And I bet Hasan has probably talked about this. I couldn't imagine Hasan doesn't know Japan is absolutely infamous for its work culture, but I want to talk about it anyway. So the BBC ran an article in early 2020 just about reforms they're trying to do in Japanese society to try and stop people from this extreme work culture. So I just want to read some of this. So Hideyuki can count on one hand the number of days he's taken off work over the past year. One day in April for my daughter's elementary school enrollment ceremony, and 2 half-days in November for a school parents' day and recital. This is more than I normally take off. The 33-year-old engineer who works for a technology company in Tokyo had only 2 days of holiday last year. It's not because he couldn't take more. He's in fact entitled to 20 days annual leave. Instead, like many Japanese workers, taking time off work beyond the absolute minimum is simply not an option. It's difficult because the atmosphere in the workplace wouldn't allow it, says Hideyuki, who has 2 children and is reluctant to give his full name, due to potential repercussions at work. I don't want my manager to be saying anything bad about me because I took the day off. It is easier to just work rather than them saying bad things about me or being told off. Japan is facing something of an epidemic in unused annual holiday leave among its famously conscientious workforce, with workers taking only 52.4% of the paid leave they were entitled to in 2018. Main reason is guilt, a reflection of the pressures and expectations that weigh heavily on a workaholic society. The average worker still has dozens of untaken vacation days every year. Why has change been so slow? Japan is the birthplace of karoshi, death from overwork, a word invented in the 1970s to describe deaths caused by work-related stresses and pressures. Unfortunately, it's still a regular fixture in Japan's lexicon today. While Western society is individualistic and non-hierarchical, Japanese society is collectivist and hierarchical, explains Hiroshi Ono, professor of human resources and management at Hitotsubushi University, who specializes in Japan's work culture. Thus, many people refrain from taking holiday because their bosses do not take holiday or they are afraid it will disrupt the group harmony. For tech worker Hideyuki, like many Japanese workers, not taking holiday leave is a normalized part of working life. It's natural not taking holiday leave. I've never thought about the impact to my family health or well-being. There are about 30 employees in our company. One colleague is already taking a long leave due to mental illness and we are short-staffed. So if one people takes a day off, it will be a burden to other staff. The managers don't take any holidays and they usually work late. None of the others are taking days off. I cannot be the only person taking time off work. His outlook is echoed by Tsuyoshi, 38, a front desk chief in a restaurant business in Gunma Prefecture, who has not checked his leave entitlement despite working there for over 4 years. When asked about colleagues' reactions to taking time off, he said they would react negatively. They will not say anything directly to that person, but they will speak ill of that person behind their back. I have never seen any colleague taking all of their paid holiday. There is a culture where you would be evaluated higher if you're not taking days off and working harder. People think taking days off is a bad thing. So like I was saying earlier, each developed capitalist country represents something kind of different on the capitalist scale. And here in Japan, you see something different, right? So most people aren't in unions, right? So the ability for organized labor to affect stuff to do with the law is far less than other countries. And then you have this work culture, which stems from traditional Japanese values, maybe even stuff to do with Bushido code and stuff like that, this collectivist mentality where people think it's a bad thing to take their sick days, even though they have them, right? In America, you don't really get sick days for a lot of people on like minimum wage or even people who've worked a long time. But in Japan, this guy was saying he had 20 days off and he only took like overall like 2. In the UK, is it like minimum 21? And you bet everyone is taking every single one of those days off. Like, people do not feel guilty at all. And I guess that's one of the good things sometimes about an individualized culture, is that when I used to take days off work, I'd just be like, screw everyone else. I don't care. I do not live to work. Sorry if that puts some people under pressure, but I don't care about this job because my labor value is being extracted by management, is being extracted by the CEO. I have no loyalty to this company. I really couldn't care less. And I would say most people in the UK workforce think like that as well, which is a redeeming thing. You don't feel that pressure to work like this. But what this does remind me of is some of the stuff I was reading about the games industry in America. Because there's so many coveted jobs, everyone goes above and beyond to try and keep their jobs in this very, very competitive space. And they feel like they can't take days off and they feel like they have to work overtime. And you can see that in Japanese culture as well, except it's so much more normalized. The government actually have to try and incentivize people through the law to start taking days off. And then it has this whole terrible working culture where people have actually died at their desks from all this stress and they work really long hours. And even in socializing, there's a culture of going out after work to socialize with other workers, basically still in the service of work. And then, like I said, I want to make a whole video about convenience stores and I want to make a whole video about vending machines. And you see what I'm getting at, right? Like, Japan is a very nice place. Tokyo is an amazing city, but so much of it feels like it's designed to serve capital. And if that is capitalism working, that is not capitalism working for the Japanese worker, because capitalism in Japan does not work for the Japanese worker. They have pretty terrible working conditions. They have a terrible working culture, which expects them to not prioritize their own health and their own lives. They should prioritize working for a company to make people as rich as possible. And then you also have the lack of unions in Japan as well. And they've been run by one neoliberal party for nearly its whole history. And that in its own way is a capitalist nightmare. And I guess Hasan would say it's a dystopia as well, but I'm not sure how aware he is of all these issues. If you go to Japan and think, you know, the nice aesthetic is not hiding anything more sinister underneath. Now, I'm not the only person who thought that. A really upvoted post on Hasan's own subreddit, like 400 upvotes, which is quite large for that subreddit, said, "I'm Japanese who grew up poor and was homeless in Japan." And this is just after Hasan was talking about economics in Japan. So I'm going to read you this. So I'm half Filipino, half Japanese. I was born and raised in Japan in a low to middle class family. My dad was an office worker and my mum was a bar singer who migrated to Japan as a Japayuki, a slang for Filipino entertainers who moved to Japan during an 80s economic bubble. When my dad died suddenly of a heart attack, my mum became the breadwinner out of the blue. At the time of his death, my mum was pregnant and wasn't working. My parents were married, but my mother wasn't a Japanese citizen and only had permanent resident status. She couldn't find the job because she was pregnant. Companies often don't hire women for this reason, and also hates giving out pregnancy compensation, and because she was Filipino. Companies often do not employ immigrants in high-earning positions. For many years until my high school graduation, we were homeless and under the poverty line, words you don't often associate with Japan. On the outside, you wouldn't be able to tell we were poor and homeless. We still dress presentable when we go outside, and Hasan was right about the clean public washrooms we took advantage of. We should have government aid, but because my mum was not a citizen, we received a very small amount from a non-profit. There were times when the local government unit of Tokyo gave us hotel rooms to stay in, especially during cold months, but these are temporary. We couldn't even work on her citizenship naturalization requirements because she no longer can. She would need a decent job and a permanent address, My mum, even though she was a well-educated, had a degree in nursing, could speak many languages, couldn't get a decent job because she was an immigrant, a woman, and a single mum. She worked 2 jobs as a factory worker and a housekeeper until we moved out of the country. Just because it looks like everything in Japan works doesn't mean the people there aren't tired. Did I also mention my dad died because of overworking? My dad loved his job only because Japan makes you believe that your worth is based on your work. If he wasn't overworking, he was seen as lazy and worthless. The only time I could see him was at night when he got home at 10 p.m. Even though his work allowed him to leave at 6. He would always bring me chocolates and chicken as compensation because he barely had any time to spend with me. I was kind of upset when Hasan picked out my chat message and history while chat was calling me American defending American copium, just because I pointed out some mistakes in Hasan's rose-coloured view of Japan and criticised his viewpoints, and I get dogpiled by the chat in return. I love his community, so being ridiculed by them was hurtful. Hasan and his friends' perspectives are all from a privileged Western lens. He's only been in the tourist parts of Tokyo, and he still talked over my points with overconfidence, assuming I didn't know what I was talking about. I know Japanese statistics online are wrong. I've literally seen local news in Osaka of volunteers who handed out a total of 20,000 sleeping bags to the homeless, and I personally stayed for a short time in a homeless park. I've always been a big fan of Hasan and I love his content, but I'm going to take a break from watching him. So I've had that post screenshotted for a long time, so maybe Hasan saw it. Does he read a subreddit? Maybe he responded to it. I hope he did, because it feels bad this person actually had this terrible experience growing up in Japan, and then Hasan's chat just started dogpiling them. I guess that's the nature of like parasocial relationships, where you just attack anyone who appears to be criticizing your fave. But I thought that was a really interesting insight just into how this stuff affects people, because we already read you the work culture being insanely toxic and that guy saying he doesn't really think about his family before his job. And then here's an actual person where someone's dad died of work-related stress and never had time for them because of his prioritization of work above all else. And it's nice that someone can actually talk about it with authority, because obviously, just like Hasan, I am a Western tourist to Japan, so I don't have that experience either. But it just shows you that, yes, the aesthetics can be nice, and the public bathrooms it mentioned there, yeah, they're pretty good in Japan. For some reason, none of them have soap in it seems like, which is really, really weird. But yeah, just like so many capitalist countries, Japan has real problems. And one more thing I want to talk about, because he talked about his mum not being able to get a job because she was an immigrant. And this is a massive problem in Japan historically, but also because everyone knows Japan has an aging population. In recent years, the government have made it easier for migrant workers to go over. And when I went to Japan, I would say the most visible migrant workers were like South Asian, forced labor, and debt trap. Migrant workers in Japan face substantial risks during the pandemic. A new report by Clean Clothes Campaign titled Made in Japan is released today, uncovering the reality of life for migrant garment workers under the state-supported TITP, based on research and interviews with migrant garment workers producing domestic brands. The report highlights a range of violations, including debt bondage, illegally low wages, verbal abuse, and unsafe working and living conditions, including TITP workers sleeping in the factories where they work. Established by the government in 1993 with the aim of solving the worker shortage resulting from an aging population, Japan's domestic garment production relies heavily on TITP migrant workers, yet the Labour Inspection Office in Japan found almost 70% of the businesses that had hired these workers were in violation of labour laws. Migrant workers are especially vulnerable to exploitation, as they often do not speak the language and lack community support or access to legal advice, and their situation has become even more precarious during the pandemic. Workers report being forced to work 18 hours a day, 7 days per week in times of peak production, earning the poverty pay of $2 to $3 per hour, far below the minimum wage of $7.13 per hour plus overtime. Added to this injustice is debt bondage, with some workers reportedly being charged $6,000 by agency as an enrollment fee for this scheme. So another article by the Associated Press wrote this: a legal case brought by a 30-year-old Filipina woman is drawing attention to a disquieting practice in Japan. Many employers confiscate the passports of foreign workers, especially Asians in low-status jobs, and refuse to return them even if the employee wants to leave the company, lawyers and labour rights activists say. Effectively, the workers are trapped in low-paying jobs where they may be bullied or abused, but are unable to seek employment elsewhere because their passports are held hostage. So recently it's been well documented that Chinese migrant workers and Korean migrant workers have not been treated well by just Japanese citizens and the Japanese government. But then of course you have a lot of migrant workers from even poorer countries like the Philippines or parts of India, Indonesia and Vietnam as well, going over to Japan and telling of similar experiences of serious abuse of migrant labor. And I think we should keep this in mind as well, that Japan is a developed country. These people are not illegal immigrants, because often when you hear stories like this is how illegal immigrants are treated. We heard a lot of stories like this coming out of Qatar, with a lot of Indian and South Asian workers going over there, having their passports stolen, forced to work brutal conditions. This is Japan doing this to legal migrants to Japan, allowing them to be treated like absolute garbage, letting employers steal their passports to essentially keep them as slaves. That is really the dark underbelly of Japanese society that keeps Japan functioning as a top global economy. And it's really no different to the United States. The United States has a ton of this stuff as well. The UK has a lot of this stuff as well. A lot of Western economies have this. So does capitalism work in Japan? Yeah, it works as intended for the capitalist. It works as intended for the 1%, whether that is exploiting cheap migrant labor to enrich Japanese companies, whether that is creating a toxic work culture to make wage slaves even more slaves to your capitalist corporation, or whether that is the lack of union movements or a right-wing political party that was massively funded by the CIA when it was originally conceived so it could stop communism, completely ruling over Japan for most of the post-war period. It doesn't seem like capitalism works just because Japan has nice things. And like I said, I love Japan. I thought Tokyo was absolutely amazing. I want to go back as well. But just like how I go to Thailand and have an amazing time, I go to Cambodia and have an amazing time. Both of those countries are dictatorships. And then I go to somewhere like Japan and it's amazing as well. But I have to keep in mind, I'm a tourist to all these countries. I don't live here. People in Cambodia told me how they can't even talk about politics in the open because they're scared of a dictatorship like taking them away. Places like Thailand are in a bit of a transition phase, and there's been massive protests against like the new king from a couple years ago, but you can't say anything bad about the king there. I still like all these countries, but I'm just not going to pretend that because Japan is nicer than the UK on the surface, it's somehow utopia we should all strive towards. And I'm not saying Hasan thinks that, because in the clip, I'm not sure if I showed you, Hasan actually says this is why all the far right love Japan. It's like their version of utopia, a very, very xenophobic capitalist place. But I'm just saying you cannot be fooled as a Western tourist by aesthetics of a place being nice to think the whole system works. Because then, Hasan, you can go to Thailand and you could probably say a similar thing. I go to Thailand and I see so much nice stuff there and I think, wow, again, can I have some of this back home? Can I have these really cool like malls with like beautiful rooftop gardens? Can I have a lot of these like amazing cultural things? Can I have a bit more cleanliness or people caring about their families enough that you don't see loads of homelessness? But me and Hasan are outsiders. We will never be treated by the Thai government or the Japanese government as a citizen. We don't have to deal with these problems. We never will. And also, we're never going to see these problems either because we are tourists. We're not going to go seek out poverty. We're not going to go talk to people who have fallen on really hard times in Japan, if we could even communicate. We're just going there to have a good time on holiday, right? And before people say, well, you're misinterpreting Hasan, I totally admit he's not saying Japan is like the end goal of humanity and saying like, oh, I found the country where capitalism works. But I do think in the clips I was watching, he maybe does kind of paint a rosier picture than it is, because like I said, you go there, on the surface it's great, but I already knew a lot of the problems in Japan, so I kept saying to my girlfriend that you shouldn't put a country like Japan on a pedestal and pretend it's better than it is, because you're an outsider and you don't know enough about the society to really take it at face value and then act like it's better than the country you're from, for example. But that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.